And it is exactly 2 p.m. on this afternoon of the 28th of January 2001. I warmly welcome you to the newest edition of On the Agenda, the second on the agenda of 2021, organized by the European Liberal Forum, the foundation of the ALDE Party of the Liberals in Europe. We are not only a think tank and foundation, but we are also a network of now 47 member organizations all across Europe. And today we're talking about a topic, well, that concerns literally everyone around us, no matter where you come from. And that is the future of EU-China relations. And we couldn't be more topical than with that subject. We have been debating in the last couple of weeks and months about the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China. One of the final acts happened on the 30th of December of last year, so relatively fresh off the press. And it seems to be a logic step to talk about the relation with this very important economic partner that we have. And in an ideal world, we would sign an investment agreement, we would sign a trade agreement, and everything would be fine. However, the world is not perfect, and we have to face something that we have to call reality. And the reality is not only that China is an economic powerhouse, but China is also our prolonged workbench in a lot of cases, the supplier of a lot of our goods and services, but it is a massive geopolitical factor with a lot of problems domestically. So a lot of the concerns about CAI come around the issue of the treaties of environment, minorities in China. But also, I think what we have to keep in mind is President Xi's messages during the Davos Forum. Well, technically his video message that he sent out, which can be read in a clearly non-multilateral way, unlike the nice word that he tried to mince. So what do we have to look at? On the one hand, we need China economically. On the other hand, we have to look at what is going on with minorities in the country, environment, Uyghurs, but also in the direct environment, like, for instance, Hong Kong, Taiwan, places like Australia, where China is trying to play its muscles. So how can the EU position itself? How should the EU position itself? And how do we go along with this important subject? This is something that we will discuss with a very distinguished panel today. And I would like to do three things before we start. I would like to thank Marie-Pierre, Hans, and Andrew for being with us today. I would like to, as a second thing, thank Beatrice Rios, our fantastic moderator of this fine series that we have. Beatrice, thank you so much again for being with us. And the last thing is, please have fun. Please be interested in what we're talking about today. Share your questions and the comments and the chat and the Q&A. And please stay with us with the European Liberal Forum for future events that we will have. Beatrice, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Daniel, always for your very kind words. And welcome everybody to this webinar. I see a lot of people already joining us for this afternoon discussion. Before we jump into the conversation, a few housekeeping rules. You have to know that this event is being live streamed in the Facebook page of the European Liberal Forum as well. And if you would like to comment and to share your thoughts, you can do it here. We have a Q&A session with you. You can be part of the conversation. If there is something that you would like to ask to our panelists, we want you to do it. You will find a Q&A place where you can leave all your questions, and we will share them with our panelists today. As Daniel was explaining, the relationship between China and the EU is a very complicated one because it touches upon a number of issues from human rights protection to foreign affairs, the Green Deal, because China is one of the biggest polluters in the world, but also trade. And of course, this comprehensive agreement that was reached at the end of 2020 was giving the chance for Europe to have an actual debate on China that was meant to happen last year during the German presidency, but because of the pandemic was very hard to have. a lot of these questions, we will be addressing them today with this amazing panel. And I won't take more of your time. I want to jump straight away into the discussion. And for that, I'd like to give the floor, first of all, to Marie-Pierre Vedran. She is a member of the European Parliament for the Renew Europe group. So please, Marie, you have the floor.
Thank you, Beatrice. And first, thank you to European Liberal Forum for organizing this webinar on EU and China relation. I think it's very important to have this opportunity to exchange with you today. And as a standing rapporteur on China for Renew Europe group, I'm very happy to have this opportunity to discuss with you more into detail the political concluded EU-China agreement on investment. So the agreement has been politically concluded the 3rd of December, and we have just access to the last version of the text last Friday. And the main goal of this agreement is, of course, to facilitate investment. And the trade relationship between the EU and China is for now very asymmetrical, like you said previously in the introduction. And the trade relationship, we have to work with the EU company, have a hard time getting access to the Chinese market, which is not the case for Chinese company in the EU. There should be more reciprocity in our trade relation with China. Thus, the main objective of this agreement is to secure the openness of Chinese market. And European companies should have more predictability in investing in China with the agreement. They should benefit from every new opening, which was not the case before. So what is China gaining? The EU international market, as you know, is already quite open. And the European side has only concerned greater opening of its markets, especially in energy sector, notably in renewable energy, with however some safeguards, and how a strategical sector will remain closed to foreign investment. So the crucial point for all our agreements will be the implementation and the respect of such commitments. Because concluding an agreement is not the end of a process, it's just the starting point, in fact. So the implementation, specifically with China, is very important, and it's very important to be focused on this aspect. And especially on the case of this agreement, we need to work some commitments. And what are the commitments so far? This agreement, we know it's not a free trade agreement, but yet the Commission insists on including a trade and sustainable development chapter in order to make sure China will respect the Labour Convention as well as the Paris Agreement. However, China has only pledged to make continuous effort to sign or ratify the ILO Convention, but it's not really already ratified yet, especially the one on forced labor. So the Parliament will have high ambitions regarding this provision, will not be silenced when it comes to human rights violation on the case of Hong Kong, of the case of Uighur. We have a lot of ambition on this topic in the European Parliament. So first, I think it is clear that the Parliament and our group especially wants China to end forced labor and to take concrete measures to fight against climate change. Declaratory commitments will be not enough for us. I will push with my colleague of Renew before the European Parliament will have to ratify the agreement, to ratify this ILO Convention, implement them, and put an end to forced labor on its territory. It will be our first demand. Other tools will be needed to reply to the very worrying context. It is time for the EU to implement new measures to get actual results regarding trade agreements. I therefore suggesting using existing tools, such as our new EU global regime for sanctions called EU Magnitsky Act, to sanction those responsible of the situation of the Uyghur and in Hong Kong, because we cannot compromise with higher values. And the EU foreign investment screening mechanism must become also operational and effectively block investment in the EU. We have, a lot of discussion about a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It should be created as soon as possible to fight against unfair foreign competition. And new instruments also be adopted in order to ban the import of good products by forced labor, and to ensure the traceability by ensuring due diligence from foreign companies. So similarly, a new instrument should be created to monitor the distortion caused by foreign subvention in the internal market. So furthermore, we have to open a broader debate on trade and sustainable development provision. Indeed, in order to make this agreement and all free trade or investment agreement to come more acceptable, the trade and sustainable development provision must gain in enforceability and introduce granularity and conditionality in the opening of the international market. This is a point that I think is crucial for the future of the EU trade policy. And I strongly believe that our partner should implement their commitments and face sanctions if they do not. And this agreement comes in a very difficult geopolitical context, marked by the tightening of Chinese policy. We already spoke about Hong Kong, this alarming testimony with Uighur minority. And citizens in our member states are becoming more and more aware of this context. So the ratification will not come before of the end of this year, but you can be sure that the European Parliament will play our role to push China for ratifying the ILO Convention, and the Commission introduction all the other instruments needed, and member states taking strong sanction against human rights and violation. And in the context, we will see in 1 year and more if they are able to give our consent to this agreement. But let's be clear and I stop here because I think it's very important also to respond at your question. Before our ratification of the agreement, China must be ratified this convention on forced labor, respect its commitment, and the EU must use all our tools at our disposal to respond to the human rights violation and the Chinese unfair practice. I don't speak about the context because I think that we are all already agree on the situation. We have a new administration in US, we have a new context, and maybe we have some doubts also on the agreement, but also on the timing and on the context of this conclusion. So now we have to work to have real commitment from Chinese government, but also to have some information with the European Commission.
Thank you so much, Marie-Pierre. We are going to, of course, talk about the change in the administration in the US and the geopolitical context in which this agreement was closed. But I was wondering, many of your colleagues said that they felt they had been sidelined when this agreement was reached by the end of the year. And you're now mentioning a number of commitments that you would like to see before the Parliament is ready to ratify the agreement. So I was wondering, is the European Parliament ready to ratify this agreement as it stands if those commitments are not fulfilled? And more generally, I would like to reflect on the fact that the European Union has been trying to use trade as a way to enforce human rights and labor rights in different countries, but we have seen that it hasn't been working very well in Vietnam, in Korea. So I was wondering, how do you see trade being used as a way to try to enforce these legislations, and how could the EU improve its performance in this sense?
Like you, with your question, we see that we have a lot of work to do, because it's a good timing, because now we have the review of the trade policy. So I think it's very important to push the Commission, and it's our role in the European Parliament, to have some engagement about enforceability. Because like I said, the conclusion is one aspect, but it's not the end of our process. And it's very very important that the EU work to defend our interests and to have the compatibility between our interests and between our ambition and our values. So we have to work with the Commission, with the Council, and with our partner to have some commitments on human rights, of course, but also on access markets, because we know that with China, we have some difficulty on human rights, and we have already mentioned the situation in Hong Kong, in Uighur, but we have also some difficulty on access markets with some partner, with you mentioned Vietnam, you mentioned Korea, and we have some difficulty on human rights, but it's more easy on market access. But with China, we have a lot of trouble on different subjects. So it's very important for the European Parliament to have answer from the Commission side on enforceability, on how a tool to have the commitments must become reality now. Because now we have a different relation with China, with Vietnam. China is a key partner and a rival systemic economic. So it's completely different. And we know that the behavior of China is not the same on Vietnam or Korean. So it's very important to have different tools and to work with the Commission, but with also our partner, also at the multilateral level, because I don't mention World Trade Organization, but it's very important to work with US also on the question of human rights, but also on foreign subsidy. So we have a lot of work during 1 year, but I'm not sure that for all my colleagues, these commitments are enough. It's just the beginning. So now we have to work with all the group to find solution.
Thank you very much. And we will address the question of enforcement of trade agreements, because this is something that has been an issue in the EU for a long time. But now I'd like to give the floor to our second panelist. He's Hans van Valen. He's the president of the ALDE party. So please, Hans, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you also, Marie-Pierre, for your expose, because I agree with it. First of all, I would like to say we deal with China, a country which is an absolute dictatorship. Human rights are systematically violated, systematically. Forced labor is a part of the system. It's not just something what happens, but it's the only way the Chinese Communist Party can maintain its rule in China. If we look on the crackdown on Hong Kong, China broke its international commitments, period. If you look towards the aggression towards Taiwan, China doesn't leave any option for Taiwan. Only reunification, and we have seen how it worked for Hong Kong. If we look at climate, the Chinese say a lot, but they don't do a lot. Climate is the biggest issue in China, threatening China itself. If we look at the WTO, the World Trade Organization, China has been a member because we, the international community, have said it's better to have them in the international system, so probably they would adopt to the international rules. It has not worked with the WTO. The World Health Organization, we know, and we should see whether China is prepared to be transparent on what it did in the first weeks to get COVID under control. We look at the Belt and Road Initiative, which makes countries in Africa and in Asia, but also in Europe, dependent in a political way. I mean, we're all interdependent economically, and that's good. So if we look at China, there is a grave problem. But we have been able to do business with the Soviet Union as well. There were also trade and investment treaties. We worked together with energy, etc. So we can do business with China, but we have to adhere to our own values. And we share those values with the United States And I'm very happy that there is a new administration with a sensible, honest, internationally minded president and vice president. So I'm very happy with, let me say, the development in the United States. And then I come to a few remarks. How is it possible that in the last days of 2020, this draft deal on investments was rushed through, literally the day before New Year? Indeed, the European Parliament have only now seen the text, so there was no need to do so. And Tony Blinken, now Secretary of State of the United States, but also Jake Sullivan, now the National Security Advisor, have time and again said that the incoming Biden administration would like to coordinate their China strategy together with the European Union. It was not done. What I see now in the European Parliament, and I'm very happy with Marie-Pierre and the EU group, that it puts so much emphasis on climate, human rights, other issues. Reciprocity, it's vital. I see also the Social Democrats moving and the Greens, but I don't see the EPP moving at all. Has that to do with the German car industry? I see President Macron, who is part of our family, who has the honor probably to be able to ratify the real deal in the French presidency, so the first half of 2022. But he will be under a lot of political strain then, because he has also to win the French elections. And again, I hope that he does. So it's now up to the European Parliament, because this is the Parliament which has to ratify. And we have to be strict, we have to be strong. And there is, before I end, also an issue. If we would have a comprehensive agreement on investment, then we have to have also a bilateral investment agreement with Taiwan. That should go hand in hand, because that doesn't mean recognition as a Republic of Taiwan at all. It doesn't mean to do away with the One China policy, but it means that we also take Taiwan very seriously, which could also be an example for China. So we have to interconnect that. And if that works, I'm in favor of a comprehensive agreement on investment and further arrangements also on trade, as Marie-Pierre said. But there is a lot to be done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think, Hans, you touch upon an issue that is very interesting as well, and is all the differences that we have seen among the member states on how to confront China, how to deal with China, and the question of the Belt and Road Initiative was key in this as well. I'm going to give the floor back to Marie-Pierre, because she has to leave, and there is a question for her, and then I promise I will give Andrew the floor. I'm very sorry for this. On forced labor, to Ms. Valen, if I understood correctly, you said that the European Parliament will not ratify the agreement if China has not signed the ILO Convention, if its commitment to work towards signing it has not resulted in anything. Am I to understand here that all the members, Renew Europe members, would vote against the comprehensive agreement on investment when the vote comes up if China, as it seems like, has not actually ratified the ILO Convention?
Thank you, Beatrice, and thank you, Hans. I fully support your position, and like you mentioned, for the French government, this agreement is important, but it's very important to have real commitments. It's why we push the subject of forced labor, because for us it's very important to have coherency on our values, on our goal, and with our trade policy. So for the European Parliament, we know that the ratification of ILO Convention on this topic is very important. But we know that ratify a convention is one thing. So it's very important to have real commitment, and we have to have real change. The ratification is just a first step. But for us, it's very important. So we push for that, especially Renew, because for example, in December, we push for a resolution of human rights and forced labor. So for us, it's very important because it's a question of coherency with our values. So we try now to convince all the European Parliament, and like Hans said, we have some different view with EPP, with S&D, with the Green, with some people. They share this ambition to have the ratification of ILO Convention. But EPP, it's not very clear at this moment. So for us, for the European Parliament, it's very important to have this first step. But this first step is not the end of the process. It's just the beginning, because enforceability is the key, very important. So it's why, and we push for that in Renew, I think that the European Commission must have more tools. We have, for example, the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer. It's good, but it's not one person who can solve all the difficulty. So we need some more human person on this topic and to work on enforceability. I'm very sorry because I have to go, but I was very happy to be here. And of course, don't hesitate to send me some questions, because it's, for us also, it's just the beginning of the debate on this agreement. So I will be happy to have the opportunity to discuss new time with you.
Thank you very much for staying with us today. Thank you, Maritia. I'd like to move now to our last speaker. He's Andrew Small. He's an Associate Senior Policy Fellow at the ECFR, and he's a Senior Trust and Elective Fellow at the Asia Program. Please, Andrew, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. Thanks a lot for the chance to join this discussion. I'll try and complement the other speakers by covering a couple of slightly different angles on this, the international dimension and the kind of looking beyond the comprehensive investment agreement. Many of the points on the agreement itself, I would echo the analysis that the two other speakers have given on that. I think whatever assessment one makes of the agreement, I think the manner in which it was reached and the timing was quite damaging for the EU internationally. I think it has had the effect of reinforcing some mistrust about Europe's approach to China among its major democratic partners. And internally, I think there's been some damage as well. I think there's been significant progress in the last couple of years on the substance and cohesiveness and signaling around EU-China policy. And I think the manner of the way this played out was a setback. What happened in December felt like an attempt to jam through not just the agreement itself, but really an entire vision of the EU-China relationship that I don't think really commands a democratic consensus in Europe anymore. And I think the cost for Europe with its partners on this, which I think can be and should be remedied, does go beyond the question of whether we can coordinate on China as such. I think whether it's Washington or Tokyo or New Delhi as well, I think some degree of like-mindedness on China, even if of course we're not going to have identical views, is starting to become a more important driver and condition for wider forms of cooperation on everything from technology regulation to supply chains to development finance and even to the quality of security ties. And I think for Europe's partners, and talk very extensively both on the US side, the Indian side, the Japanese side, it's obviously huge interest in the CAI at the moment. I think it looked less like strategic autonomy, as some have been attempting to sell this as, and a bit more like free riding. It looked like taking advantage of the pressure that had been growing on China over the emergence of these kind of new coalitions that the Biden administration was planning to pursue, to cut a bilateral deal at virtually the first opportunity, even before it was possible for the new administration to take office. And I think really it confirmed a lot of the underlying and long-standing concerns that these countries had about European China policy, where they had thought that we turned a corner in the last couple of years. And I think particularly given the level of aggression, repression that we've seen from China in the last year, playing so willingly into Beijing's interest in undercutting the new US administration's agenda, and fairly cheaply too, rather than giving these coalition building efforts the best possible chance to succeed and signaling serious collective concerns to Beijing, did really have the effect of undercutting Europe's wider strategic interests in favor of, frankly, some relatively narrow ones in terms of the good bits that come out of this agreement. But I think it is already important that we start looking beyond the CAI. I think the worst thing that could now happen is if this ends up completely dominating the China agenda for Europe over the next year, and the agenda with international partners as well. And I think we really have to use this moment and actually some of the outcry that has resulted from it, to try and make advances on a few other fronts as a result of that. Firstly, I think is to move faster and harder on Europe's toolkit in dealing with China. There are areas where there's been progress in the last period of time, some of which have been mentioned: investment screening, export controls, some of the scope that's afforded by the Magnitsky Act, the very ambitious white paper on subsidies. But there are also areas that have continued to lag, including the International Procurement Instrument, the backing for the EU's connectivity agenda. And then there are some other new areas, including counter-economic coercion tools and the EU Indo-Pacific strategy that still, of course, need a lot more work. And I think if the KAI is to move forward, it should really be more credibly embedded in a wider China policy framework. The claim was that it would be, and I don't think that really fully happened under the German presidency. And I think that really does need to be a priority push in the coming period, sharpening some of the competitive elements of European policy, even adversarial, rivalrous, however one wants to characterize them, having banked really so much in recent months on the cooperative part which the KAI represents. The second, I think, is to be more ambitious in dealing with democratic partners and allies on thinking through our China agenda. I'll focus on the US quickly now, but much of this does hold for India, Japan, and other partners, and strongly echo Hans van Baalen's point about including the investment agreement with Taiwan, which the space for which should in principle now be opened up by the KAI and would be a very important step to go alongside it. I think there's still a kind of detectable sense of insecurity that if the Biden administration arrives offering to coordinate China policy more closely, that doing this seriously on the European side might involve some kind of subordination to US leadership or committing to a form of bloc politics, as we've been hearing from the speeches at Davos in recent days. I think this kind of attitude was understandable a decade ago when Kurt Campbell, as the new Asia head in the White House, was last coming through Brussels with his transatlantic Asia cooperation agenda. But I think it kind of misses the feel and the point of where things are at now. The Biden administration's approach is not just about getting plus ones for US strategy. I think it's come out of a recognition of the limitations of a unilateral approach that the Trump administration very successfully demonstrated. I think the sense on the US side now is that building collective leverage on China is becoming a necessity rather than a luxury. I personally see a kind of much more chastened and genuinely consultative spirit about how this is being dealt with and is likely to be dealt with by the Biden administration, by comparison, not just with the Trump administration on some of this, but even going back to the Obama administration's approach too. And I think some of the main areas the new administration will be looking to Europe on vis-a-vis China, whether it's trade, technology, standards, green transition, these are areas of European strength. This is Europe operating in lots of places at peer level. I don't think this is just about being a junior partner in East Asia, as people had maybe feared in the past. And I think a more self-confident European approach to this would look to shape and influence what an ally-based approach to China actually looks like, and use that to gain leverage on European priorities, and in really helping to define a collective approach with the US and a number of other partners that we can live with. This is obviously an opportunity to revisit a number of difficult issues with the United States, with China as the backdrop: data flows, technology regulation, WTO reform, carbon border adjustment mechanism, as was mentioned earlier. But I think there is no question that we are going into some of these exchanges with a couple more question marks surrounding the depth and scope of transatlantic cooperation after some of what's played out with the KAI. And I think it will be helpful to be ready to put a bit more on the table and to do a bit more damage control if we really want to counteract this. I think it's important that our aim should not be to pursue differentiation for its own sake. We're never on an EU level going to be able to marshal collective pressure on our priorities with China effectively, whether it's on non-market practices, human rights, rule of law in the maritime domain, competition in third markets, technology standards, a whole list of areas, values agenda in a multilateral institution. If we're so hung up on distinguishing our position from the US and others that we can't actually fully coordinate with some of our other partners effectively, all of whom are dealing with an incredibly similar looking set of issues. I do think this is not going to be bloc politics, though. I think a lot of the coalition work is going to be fluid. informal, issue-based. Some of it won't reference China at all. Much of it will actually be focused on, I think, a positive sum agenda that's about strengthening our own collective capacities and resilience and providing more attractive trade, development finance, investment offers in places where we're competing with China for markets or competing on values. But I think it would be quite perverse if at just the moment that the United States makes, I think, probably its most open offer to craft an approach to these issues together, we decide that this is the moment to go it alone, particularly if it's for the sake of a deal with China that, whatever its overall merits, I think is still of relatively marginal value in terms of our priorities in the EU-China relationship.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I found very interesting this reflection, because I feel that sometimes when we talk about the strategic autonomy, it's like if the EU need to go alone on everything, when there are so many issues that we have to deal with regarding China, but not only, that we definitely need to have like-minded partners all across the world. Otherwise, it's going to be very hard to achieve these, particularly when it comes, for example, for the reform of the WTO. This is something that we cannot do alone. We need to have our partners on our side, and the US has proven that we need to do that together, and that it's not only the US, it's other countries as well that need to be involved and part of the conversation. There are a lot of questions coming from the audience, and I'm going to thank you for being part of the conversation, because I think that's fantastic. And I definitely, I'm going to jump straight away. But I wanted to have a reaction from Hans on what Andrew was saying about Kai being just part of a broader agenda for the EU when it comes to China, and how do you see this particular agreement playing out in this dynamic?
Well, I agree with him. Of course, we have this investment issue, this potential deal. We have, of course, broader trade issues, but also indeed, if you talk about the Green Deal, if you talk about environment, climate. So we have a very broad China agenda, as China has also a very broad EU agenda and United States agenda. The question is, of course, if you are bargaining, if you are closing a deal, it's the deal which is, let me say, before you. So it's either to go for this Kai or not. My feeling is that there will be immense pressures to ratify. And then the European Parliament has to decide, is ILO ratification of ILO agreements on forced labor, is it vital or not? Otherwise, it's just a kind of easy commitment. You say we are in favor of it, we hope that China will do it, but we close a Kai instead of hard commitment. And I trust the Renew group, but I don't trust many other groups in this respect. To be honest. Again, also the linking with Taiwan is vital. It is a democracy, a full democracy, with a woman president, with a transgender as minister for digital, freedom to demonstrate, freedom for the economy. It has fought COVID in a great way. And I don't say that we should divert from this one China policy. Personally, I don't like it, but politically, I have to accept it. But we can do a lot there, also in the negotiations, to make it possible to have this bilateral investment agreement. Again, there will be a lot of negotiations going on. I'm in favor of this broad agenda, but we have to decide on ratification of Kai or not. And I think it will be in the end ratification. And then we have to be quite honest, what do we get out of it? Not only for Europe itself, reciprocity, but also in our basic values. We can't say no to a Mercosur agreement because of labor rights, social rights, and human rights, and just forget about it concerning China.
Absolutely. I was actually going to comment on that indeed, and I was wondering whether you think, the both of you, that the fact that this agreement was rushed in such a context has actually endangered the ratification in itself, because if we have this sort of agreement at the very last minute, maybe now it's not going to be accepted by the member states because it was particularly pushed by France and Germany on the one hand, and by the European Parliament because of the way it was agreed. And then I was also wondering, this has been perceived, and Andrew was talking a little bit about this, as a diplomatic win by China. Do you see it that way, or do you see that the European Union has gotten enough out of this agreement?
No, it has not got enough. But I've spoken around Christmas with a lot of leaders inside Europe and outside Europe. And there was a tremendous pressure by China. The Prime Minister of China called every Prime Minister in the European Union to say, you should accept this draft CAI. I've spoken with national trade ministers, and also they were taken by surprise. So it is part of the China mechanism to bully, to pressure, to give, let me say, also grants and so-called compromises. And therefore, I rely on the European Parliament because it is the central factor about ratification. And given all the speeches and commitments of the European Parliament in all the areas we discussed, it should be a tough negotiator. And, you know, in the end, I don't know which country in the EU will say no, which government will say no. But therefore, we have a European Union. I mean, together we're stronger. So I rely on the European Parliament, in the end on the Commission, although I was not impressed by the fact that they accepted the rush of Merkel in this way. But again, the European Parliament has now all the cards.
We'll see how they use them. I'm going to jump straight away into all the questions that we have, because we have many. The first one is coming from Guillermo Pasas Varo, the Ciudadanos. One of the main points concerning an investment and trade partnership is regulatory harmonization. China and the EU have been very different regulatory standards, not just in terms of rule of law, but also in other aspects such as IP law and public procurement. To all the very distinguished speakers, do you think that the conclusion of this agreement would seriously compromise our regulatory framework, particularly concerning the lack of multilateral approach and the growing Chinese bargaining power in the international scene? And most importantly, how are we sure that the agreement is properly enforced, considering the lack of legal certainty in China? And he comments, frankly, I don't think that the rules of the treaty enforcement will work the same way with China as they would work with liberal democracies such as Canada or Japan, which actually brings me to one of the points that I wanted to make, and this that then when it comes to the monitoring and enforcement of the trade agreements, the EU has had a problem with this. So maybe first from Andrew, a reaction to this question, and then we'll go back to Pat.
Sorry, it just glitched out. To react first to this. So I'm not overly concerned about the kind of harm to wider regulatory cooperation. I think this is going to be one of the areas that can be pursued by the EU with a number of partners quite effectively, regardless of the CAI. I think people are preparing for that nonetheless. I mean, I think this is going to be one of the areas on the transatlantic front, in particular, that can be pushed forward. So that dimension of things, I would be less concerned about. I mean, I think the argument that's I mean, we now have the details a bit on the enforcement mechanisms, which are, you know, essentially political enforcement mechanisms in nature, in terms of the kind of the actors that are involved on the Chinese side. This is going to require political willingness on China's side to adhere to its commitments, and the pressure is going to have to come in at a political level. And the question is as much going to be whether this corresponds to other priorities that China has domestically on this. A lot of the things that China had agreed to were for certain domestic reasons or commitments they've made elsewhere, things that they may have wanted to pursue anyway. And so I'd be skeptical about the degree to which the new mechanisms as such create significant forms of external pressure that are going to make a qualitative difference in any of these areas. I can see the argument that says it is easier to push China on areas that it's already agreed to than on issues that it hasn't. And there is a different kind of quality in terms of commitments that China has. I mean, if you look at the adherence to certain areas of the WTO commitments, there are areas in which they have followed through on their commitments as well. It is obviously easier to create certain forms of pressure around this than on issue areas where there's simply been a total unwillingness to make movement on China's part. But I think that's obviously the pervasive area of skepticism about this, that really the enforcement of this is going to depend on an agenda that continues to be set in Beijing, will reflect domestic priorities, and is not going to reflect a huge amount of the substance of the agreement.
And in any case, this is a very limited agreement, so there are a lot of those issues that it doesn't even touch upon particularly. Maybe Hans, a reaction on this?
Yes, concerning all technicalities, I agree with Andrew. I mean, the Commission can sort this out, but the question is also whether China will let us influence them, and they don't want to do that. So they look for the Chinese interest, which is the Communist Party's interest, is Xi Jinping's interest. And I think what is important is the word reciprocity. So if we are not able to buy more than 49% of a Chinese company, they should under no condition be able to do the same with us. That's easy. That's rather easy. That's the test. And I have not been able to study the telephone books, which are the size of the draft deal. But that must be clear. If there is no real reciprocity, we can't do it. If there is, it's worthwhile, very much. And then we have also the other instruments which Andrew referred to, which are outside CAI to deal with China. And again, I said in my introduction, we have been able to do deals with the Soviet Union as well. I don't see China as more democratic, open, or whatever than the then Soviet Union. So we can deal with them, but again, if we are tough and transparent. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. And talking about the relations between China and the EU, we have another question from Elke Strike. How do you see the future relations between the EU and China concerning the global digital industry, especially with regards to the EU's goal to further develop its own tech companies? This is very hot news debate in the EU at the moment. Who would like to go first? Maybe Andrew? Hans?
Okay.
You're here now.
Let's see here. If we talk about tech, about digitalization, etc., we have a lot to do in the European Union, which has nothing to do with China. If you talk about European autonomy, we have to do a lot in these circles which we refer to the tech industry, irrespective of China. In dealing with China, with their tech companies, again, I said reciprocity, absolute reciprocity. Huawei is that we say, they say technically an independent company, but it's not, because the security regulations make it obligatory on Huawei to do everything necessary to advance, let us say, the interest of the Chinese state and the Communist Party. So I would say, don't use Huawei for your strategic communications, those kinds of things. And again, also here we should talk with other countries, Japan, India, United States. But the most important thing is that we are taking, let me say, our so-called autonomy, strategic autonomy, for real, that we really invest in our tech industry, that we make it state of the art, more advanced than it is today. Well, that is also the idea of the European Commission, but in a democracy like the member states and the European Union is, it takes long, too long.
Way longer than in China, for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, I would add, I mean, there are different questions in play with this. One is the sort of system openness question for different countries generally to the European technology sphere. I think given, and this applies to the 5G case, it applies to data, particularly consumer-facing Chinese companies, where the different legal environment, simply political environment in China, the uses to which some of the technologies will be put when it comes to, of course, as well, Chinese investments in Europe, Chinese acquisitions of European companies, Chinese access to even parts of the education system. There are a whole series of these questions where we've kind of made some provisional progress on figuring out the parameters, but it's still often adjustment after the fact. And we have some deep questions to resolve about the kind of totality of system openness, given the nature of China's agenda when it comes to technology acquisitions in Europe, and the presence which will grow as China's, including the consumer-facing Chinese companies move out, including on fintech side. There's a whole series of different areas where China's access to European data is going to matter more, and where we still haven't reached a particularly comprehensive solution or way of thinking about that. And then on the other side, we are going to be dealing with a much bigger push from a number of other actors, including the US, but a whole cluster of countries to look at different forms of technology partnerships, industrial policy partnerships. Some of these are things we'll be doing on an EU basis alone, but there are going to be more of these where the nature by which value chains, choke point technologies, all of these sorts of things work means that you can't do this, the US can't do it alone, the EU can't do it alone. There's going to be a number of other parties that need to reach agreements on the parameters of the totality of the openness of their systems, forms of cooperation with each other in these areas. It's not necessarily to go back to a kind of COCOM version of this, but we are going to need to have more serious collective consultations. We did it again in a very kind of after the fact way on 5G in the last few years. We've done it in limited ways on things like export controls and investment screening and trying to be lined up, and very specific companies on chips and a few other kind of chip design and a few other specific areas. But we do now have an opportunity to sit down with various other partners. Even industry is starting to push for this, that we need a more collective solution among a number of democracies to how we settle this. It's been a highly unpredictable environment for a lot of the industry on this in the last few years as well, when it comes to how we approach China's access to some of these things across a series of different domains. But this is something I think, again, going back to the new administration, where we've been highly subjected to decisions that have been taken by the US Commerce Department and others in the last period of time, where we have an opportunity to try and shape that framework more convincingly and over hopefully a longer period of time to build that predictability, and including for our industry as well.
This is going to be definitely a very interesting debate, because the EU doesn't necessarily share the same stand when it comes to these issues with the US either. So it's going to be a big conversation about how do we regulate. And there has been also a debate about the fact that because particularly the US and China, they have been the one holding that tech companies, they have been also making the rules. And now the EU wants to become a leader in regulatory framework, but it's hard to do that when you have not been part of the market just yet. Talking about something that we were discussing before, there is a question from Philippe Benon. How do we develop a multilateral approach to China policy across interested democracies? The US and the EU must cooperate on this, and hopefully include the UK, Australia, and others. I agree entirely that hopes that including China and international organizations would lead to improve the records, but they have indeed a free riding in more manner. But how do we progress, and how long can it take? Hans, you would like to jump in?
Maybe I don't want to end in a skeptical way, but when we said that Russia should become a part of the Council of Europe, because that would get them in the framework, it would mean that they would respect the rule of law and individual freedoms. It has totally not worked, 100% failure. So you have to go to hard politics. And it means that China understands hard politics. what does China need? China needs an international market for their products. China needs investments in their own country. China needs a solution to the immense pollution in China itself and the lack of clean water, which is an immense problem. So it's not that China is that great super state. No, it's also dependent on us. And we should know where we talk with China and also where, if necessary, where we hit China, because also China is doing that to us. Therefore, the democracies in the world, but not only the United States and the European Union, but also, as you rightly pointed out, Japan, India, other countries should work together. And we should not use one tool, but Andrew talked about the toolkit. There are many tools in that toolkit. So there is not one big strategy, but maybe 20 small strategies adding up together. So if we do business with China that way, we can improve the international situation, make it more stable, and we can help the Chinese, because I'm inclined not to believe that democracy is alien to the Chinese people and citizens. Taiwan has proven differently. Asia can be democratic. It will be discrimination to say that it cannot be. And democracy should help each other.
Absolutely. We had also a few comments from Hong Kong on our chat that were very powerful indeed. This is very important that we highlight in the discussion. Maybe, Andrew, you would like to comment on this issue?
Sure. I mean, this is going to be, I think I highlighted in the initial presentation that there's an anxiety at the moment about getting engaged in blocks. I don't think this is going to be about a single kind of anti-China coalition or something like that. It's not going to look like that. I think there's an understanding on a number of the different the parties, yeah, on the US side, but again, I think it's important not to put excessive stress on the fact that that the US piece of this. A lot of this is going to be about relations between European and Asian democracies, as much as it is what's going on the Washington end. But there's going to be very different kinds of coalitions that make sense depending on the issue set. There's going to be different forms of security cooperation that need to be pursued in the Indo-Pacific. There's going to be different forms of technology cooperation that need to take place. There's going to be different groupings that fit together on trade, as we've seen with US, EU, Japan. You can go down quite a long list of these where you're not just going to get a D10 or that the G7 is going to do this, or this isn't going to be pursued. It will be useful. We have mechanisms for trying to stitch some of this together into a more coherent fashion. The US-EU exchanges, we have a formal dialogue that's been established on China. I think it's valuable to step back and look what this looks like. Consider what this looks like in an integrated way, but you're not going, a lot of this is going to be pursued relatively discreetly. It's going to be pursued without even talking about China. It's going to be about what agenda do we have to pursue together in other areas in light of the challenge that China poses. We've been quite hung up on the kind of counter-China agenda in the last period of time, rather than the positive some offers to other countries. I think it's going to look like something that is not a single kind of this counter-China coalition idea that is there, this pure kind of united front. It's going to look like something much more fluid, much more issue-based, and where we're going to have to work through a lot of different mechanisms to pull this off, rather than one single uniform way of navigating these questions. And if there is an attempt to do it in an excessively uniform way, there will be resistance, and not just from the European side. I think there are a number of other countries that will have complex, different trade-offs that they're making in their relationship with China, and will not want to get themselves put in a single camp on this. But the fact is that the democracies and the market liberal democracies will have to work together in different ways. And I think there's a recognition of that, and helpfully there is greater openness and commitment to doing that on the part of a number of countries than there was even a couple of years ago. And a lot of that's come about as the result of what we've seen from Chinese behavior in particular over the last year. But I think this greater collective recognition of what we're now dealing with, particularly under Xi Jinping.
Thank you very much for that. And I think we should never forget that indeed every country has its own interest towards China. And that's something that has been creating some troubles even within the European Union. Maybe a last reaction on this question. How do you see the dynamic between the different countries within the European Union? And how is that affecting to the position that the EU has towards China, not only on trade deals, but when we were talking about technology, different approach towards 5G, different approaches towards the growth of Belt and Road Initiative. They maybe a last summary of your position on this, because we are running out of time, but I would like to give you the floor one more time. So maybe Hans, you would like to stick on this.
What I hope is that the French presidency is inclusive and is unbiased. Macron is a statesman. He's pro-European. He is in favor of European autonomy. And it means that the French presidency must not rush through the final ratification, but accept that there are different views in the EU, that they have to take them seriously, and that in the end it's a good deal for the European Union as a whole, not only for Germany or for France. And I know that Macron is serious in this respect. So it has to do how we work together in the EU concerning this CAI ratification. It has to do how we work in the world. And we can make it successful if we obtain some goals. As I said, reciprocity is vital. Secondly, I see this bilateral investment agreement with Taiwan also as a vital element to test China. And third, our commitments to civil liberties and human rights are vital. Either we don't mention it, or we live up to it. And I'm speaking now about forced labor, concentration camps, the repression of minorities, etc. But I think that President Macron will be able to bring this together. And that's a positive end of a very important discussion organized by ELF. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, for that final one. Maybe Andrew, what would you like to say about these differences between member states and how to approach China?
I'll only say that the differences on China can sometimes be exaggerated. Yes, there are different views around Europe. There are different balances of views around Europe on China policy. There are non-identical views on these questions, but actually on a lot of areas that matter, China is has not necessarily been the most difficult area of European policy, I think, to reach agreement on. I think a lot of the differences on the big issues have been possible to be bridged. I think occasionally you've had situations in which specific spoilers have blocked common statements, but I think that's been more the exception than the rule. I think we've seen a lot of progress in the last couple of years in agreeing some quite difficult things. I mean, I think if you wound back a few years ago, the idea that every head of government in Europe would sign up to a concept that described China as a systemic rival would just have been absolutely unthinkable. I think there is a more collective recognition that even if countries don't want to be beaten up individually, as we've seen on the CAI, and as we're likely to see when we're talking about CAI ratification, it doesn't mean that behind the scenes they don't recognize what's at stake with this. And I think on a number of the instruments that have already been agreed, we've seen that progress. We've already seen that progress, and I'm a bit more optimistic about the idea that actually on a European basis, it is on some of these areas that are so central to the future of the European economy, European values, Europe's position in the world, that people have to step up and make these adjustments. And I think we've seen that to a certain extent already, but I would be less pessimistic about the people who think that the differences around these issues are going to prevent the capacity for Europe to operate in that respect. I don't think the evidence suggests that that's the case. And I think the greater the recognition of the stakes on this, the greater the the willingness to reach some compromises on these areas and step up. I do think the way the CAI process was handled was kind of a hit on that. There is some disquiet and reaction from a number of other member states to the way that played out as well. I think there's some things to fix there too. But I think given how important this now is to every dimension of the European agenda, I think we're in a very different place now on what's possible on China policy nonetheless.
Thank you very much. And I think it's a very positive note to finalize both with your view that we are not so divided in this. We can have a common stand, and definitely that's going to be the one that we pursue in the next few years, and that word of unity for enhance as well. Thank you very much to everyone today. I have to apologize because we wouldn't have the time to answer all of your questions that were very interesting, but we have limited time, so we couldn't go into all of them. But thank you so much for being part of the conversation, sharing your thoughts and your questions and your views on the discussion today. Thank you to our panelists and to Marie-Pierre, who had to leave, for your insightful comments. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation today. And before we finish, I'd like to give the floor to Antonio Nestoras, who is Policy and Research Coordinator at the European Liberal Forum, for a final word.
Thank you, Beatrice. Yes, I don't want to hold up everyone else for more. Congratulations to me, also to the organizing team. Well done, Adre. And thank you very much for our distinguished guests. You helped us a lot today. You eliminated the main issues of the debate, but you also managed to advance our thinking on this topic. If I can just very quickly summarize what has been mentioned. You talked about the need for reciprocity. The deal is asymmetrical as it stands, but the EU is one of the largest economic blocs in the world. We need to be treated fairly. You talked about the need of conditionality. The principle applied in international trade is not perfect, we know, but the EU is a champion of human rights in the world. We need to know that our trade partners treat their own people fairly again. And then third one, transparency. I cannot emphasize this enough. Again, we understand that trade deals entail sensitive negotiations. That's, if we have to be realistic, this is true. But before anything else, the EU needs to be fair towards its own citizens. The way European Commission conducted this trade deal was far from optimal. It was mentioned a couple of times. Especially if you take into consideration other issues, other situations that are currently on the agenda, the EU, the Commission needs to be more transparent, especially towards the European Parliament. So based on all this, I'm even more certain than before this discussion that we should not look at EU-China relations as purely as a trade issue, but as a fair trade issue. So with this final word, a big thank you to our guests in the audience as well for joining us today. We'll be back at the same time, same place in 2 weeks from now for the next On the Agenda meeting. That is the 11th of February. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.